So how was it that a few hundred Spaniards were able to take down two of the most powerful civilizations in Mesoamerica, the Aztecs and the Incas? Both of these civilizations, the Aztecs and Incas, ruled over millions of people. They had massive armies, they had advanced cities, and they had centuries of history behind them. Yet, within just a few short decades, both of these civilizations fell to a much smaller force of foreign invaders. But why did this happen? Right? The Spanish didn't win through brute force alone. There was a variety of factors that went into their ability to take down these civilizations and establish their own in their place. Right? They used a mix of religious manipulation, psychological warfare, disease. They had more advanced technology, and they took advantage of trade networks and lingua francas in order to spread Spanish and spread Spanish control. Right? And this is the story of how they did it. So in 1519, Cortés arrived on the shores of Mexico with fewer than 600 men and found a civilization that contained millions of people, the Aztec Empire, one of the most powerful in the Americas. But, curiously enough, in both the case of the Aztecs as well as the Incas, both of these civilizations had a myth of a god that disappeared out into the sea, right, promising to one day return, right? And so in both cases of the Inca and Aztec Empire, one of the reasons that is theorized why they fell so easily is because, especially in the beginning, before things started to get out of hand, they thought that these people, Cortés and Pizarro, were actually the living reincarnations of their gods who had disappeared and promised to come back. Right? Now, I've been doing a bunch of reading on this into the Aztec Empire and the Incan Empire. And specifically in the case of the Aztecs, it's kind of debated whether Moctezuma thought that Cortés was actually the return of the feathered serpent god Quetzalcoatl. However, it definitely favored them because instead of attacking right away and just taking these people out, they gave them a chance just out of maybe curiosity or unsureness to establish a foothold, gather information, and start to make allies with some of the enemies of the Aztec Empire, the Tlaxcaltecos. Now, one of the huge reasons that this small force of Spaniards, less than 200 in the case of Pizarro and around 600 in the case of Hernán Cortés, were able to take out entire civilizations is because of a massive discrepancy in the level of technology, right? The Spaniards came in with steel weapons, horses, and gunpowder, right? Which was matched up against, for the Aztecs, things made out of obsidian, bows, and more basic Bronze Age type weapons. Now, while these were lethal killing weapons in their own right, when put up against Spanish steel, they weren't much of a challenge, right? The Spaniards' swords would stay sharp and stay unbroken, while the clubs and swords of the Aztecs and the Incas would tend to just break apart, right? Especially when met with the harder substance of steel. Right? On top of this, they had things like muskets and cannons, which were loud and could be extremely disorienting to these civilizations that had never seen these things before, right? This would be super capable of breaking enemy morale, and also, I think, probably for a lot of them, maybe this is just a theory, this might have led them to think like, oh, maybe these people actually are gods because they're coming with these crazy war machines, and also they're coming with horses, right? The Aztecs and the Incans had never seen horses before, right? They never used horses in their day-to-day life, right? And so this was extremely disorienting and just a confusing new factor to deal with, right? For example, one of the most shocking battles was the Battle of Cajamarca by Pizarro against the Incan Empire, right? Where 168 Spaniards defeated an army of 80,000 Inca warriors, right? And they did this by striking first. They used firearms, and they used cavalry, which was not something that the Incas were super good at defending against, right? And it led to them, with less than 200 people, destroying a force that was 50 times its size. Now, the most powerful weapon that the Spaniards brought was actually not steel, and it was not gunpowder, but rather disease. Smallpox, measles, and influenza wiped out a huge portion of these native populations who had not developed the resistance to these new European viruses that were being brought over, right? These diseases wiped out anywhere from 50 to 90% in the case of the Caribbean islands of the native population, and this was before many even saw a Spanish soldier. For example, in 1525, one of the Inca emperors, Huayna Capac, died of smallpox. They still hadn't died of smallpox, which caused a civil war between his son Atahualpa and Huáscar. Right? And by the time Pizarro arrived in 1532, the empire was already in chaos between this civil war and the arrival of this disease vectors. Right? This level of disease weakened entire populations and entire empires, making the ability for them to conquer much, much easier. Right? Now, once these empires were actually conquered, they did a few different things in order to make sure that they stayed conquered and stayed part of the Spanish Empire. Right? One of the things was manipulating religion. Right? One big thing that they did is that they would tear down temples. For example, the Templo Mayor in Mexico City, which was originally to one of the Aztec gods, was torn down, and the cathedral was built on its ruins. Right? The same thing happened to various temples in Cusco that were torn down and built back as monasteries and churches. But once the Spanish gained control, they didn't just rule politically. They wanted to bout these indigenous customs and replace them with Christianity and faith to the Pope. One way they did this was by destroying temples and building Christian places of worship, whether monasteries, nunneries, or churches, on top of the ruins. This, for me, is an interesting method of conquest because the adults would continue to go to the same places and pray to their gods, and Spaniards didn't really care. But the children would be brought up in that Catholic environment, and so would feel the influences of Catholicism and stay loyal to that religion instead of start to lose the religion of their ancestors and of the old empires. However, Catholicism wasn't always fully adopted by everyone, and it was actually something that they kind of let happen, the Spaniards did. The indigenous, especially the older generation, was pretty not happy about having to give up their religion, and so they adapted their religion to this new Catholicism so that they can continue to worship in secret while not having to worry about persecution from the Spaniards. Now, in many parts of America, this combination of Catholicism with indigenous beliefs created a kind of syncretic religion, right? Where they had portions of their prior mixed with Catholicism. For example, in Peru, the Virgin Mary was oftentimes linked to Pachamama, one of their goddess of the earth, right? And in the Incas and in the Aztec Empire, the Virgin was mixed with, is now known as the Virgin de Guadalupe, which we can go into that later on. It was kind of to the god of Tonaltzin, one of the major female goddesses in the Aztec pantheon. And so essentially the old gods were brought into the Catholic religion and were identified with certain saints, right? Like Pachamama, Virgin Mary, was seen as a spiritual force governing agriculture, fertility, and nature, for example. Similarly, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god of the Aztecs, was often reinterpreted as Christ-like figure, the Aztec version of Christ. In the face of Spanish Catholicism, he became a symbol of divine sacrifice and resurrection. As well, for example, the god of Tlaloc, the rain god in the Aztec pantheon, remained as a Catholic saint. Specifically, San Isidro el Labrador, which, funnily enough, as I'm thinking about it, here in Oaxaca, a lot of the towns, their patron saint is San Isidro el Labrador. Interesting to think about. Right? And this blend native and Catholicism showed the Spaniards to kind of adapt. Things kind of go effort to maintain peace and maintain order within their new empire, right? Versus explicitly forcing European level Catholicism on everybody. Now, in the case of the Caribbean islands, because illness was such a huge factor and wiped out so much of the population, this syncretism happened not with the Taino religions, but rather with a lot of the African and specifically Yoruba religions, right? The African slave trade brought millions of people over from Africa into the Caribbean at this time, right? Who already had vastly different religious practices, right? This, in fact, led to the development of one pretty famous religion of Santería, which is this mixture of Yoruba with Catholicism, which is still practiced today in many parts of Hispaniola, Cuba, Puerto Rico. They took some of these Yoruba gods, like Orisha, and reimagined them as Catholic saints, right? For example, Shango, the god of thunder and the sky, was linked to Saint Barbara, and Yamaya, the goddess of the sea, was associated with the Virgin Mary. And then specifically in Haiti, you saw this mixture develop into Vodou, and they did the same thing, where their loas, their spirits, were linked to various different saints. Papa Legba, for example, the gatekeeper of the spirit world, is associated with Saint Peter, and Ersuli, the goddess of love, is linked to the Virgin Mary. So, from taking the Virgin Mary and adapting her to Pachamama or the Virgin de Guadalupe in Mexico, from taking Quetzalcoatl and linking him with Jesus Christ, or the blending of African religions in the Caribbean and linking them up with different saints in the Catholic religion. The Spaniards went the route of enforcing their religion, but also allowing elements of the prior religions to play through, right? And for the original generation, that had a huge significance. They were truly just praying to their gods. But as time went on, they kind of lost identity and just kind of started together for the future generations, right? However, these unique religious beliefs, traditions, are a testament to the adaptability and the willingness to change a little bit in order to keep a huge part of their culture of the indigenous and African peoples that were brought or lived in Latin America. And the last big thing that they used to take advantage of, the last thing that they took advantage of was the fact that in the two big empires of the Aztecs and the Incas, they already had a lingua franca, being Quechua in the Incas or Nahuatl in the Aztec Empire, right? And so instead of just ousting these languages and imposing Spanish and that everybody learned Spanish, what they did was they did the reverse. They took advantage of these previous trade routes and the fact that a lot of people already knew these languages and began to spread the religion through those languages instead. They had priests come along and learn the native languages so that they could share and preach in those languages. And over the years, they did force Spanish on the natives, right? But especially in the beginning, they chose to go the easier route of taking advantage of the language that everybody already knew to be able to spread their religion faster and gain more converts and followers. Right? If you like this video, be sure to like it, subscribe, all this stuff. If you want to join a Spanish class, whether a private or an upcoming group class, be sure to send me a message with the contact info down below in the description. Leave any comments down below, anything you want me to do in the future. Otherwise, have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.